One.
Hello, everyone out there in internet land. I'm Oren Nimni, and I'm here with Nathan Robinson, and we are two of the editors from Current Affairs magazine. We are also two people that grew up during the Iraq War, and two people that are extremely disturbed by the killing of other human beings.
And we don't
And
like it.
No, we're not fans. We're not fans. And so we wanted to have a discussion today because it seems like the U.S. Go for it. I mean,
I'm getting deja vu. Are you getting deja vu?
I mean,
have you ever had deja vu where you're like, seems like that happened?
This is an extreme form of deja vu. I saw someone post something good that they woke up from a nightmare as though they had an AP test the next day because they thought they were back in high school.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the feeling that I've been having.
Yes.
So the U.S. seems to be marching towards war with Iran.
Maybe
other people.
Who knows?
Possibly. I don't want that. And you don't want that.
No.
And the media, the mainstream media, seems to have switched immediately to saying, yes, this is a good war, and beating the war drum very quickly, maybe criticizing Trump on the margins, but not really doing any serious thinking about the situation. So I thought it would be good for us to have a little bit of a conversation. You just put out an article.
I did.
Online in Current Affairs that everyone should go read. It's good companion reading to this.
Currentaffairs.org.
It's called
How to Avoid Swallowing
Currentaffairs.org.
Propaganda.
Exactly. It is called How to Avoid Swallowing War Propaganda. And so we don't want people to swallow war propaganda.
No, we don't.
It is not tasty. You could swallow many better things.
Some of it is tasty. The human drive towards... I mean, nationalism could be very satisfying. I think it's not actually clear at the moment whether we are or are not hurtling towards open war with Iran. A lot is going to depend on how Iran chooses to respond to the fact that we just assassinated one of its top leaders in what is
and other people.
And other people died too.
Other people died. I want to make that clear. Multiple people died. Everyone seems to be focused on one person.
One of Oren's hang-ups is that when someone prominent is killed with a bunch of other people just talk about the one prominent person.
They're like, oh, look, Soleimani died. It's like, there's a bunch of other people whose families are pretty sad right now because they were just bombed.
True. So,
to smithereens. But yes, I agree with you that it will depend a lot on Iran's reaction. It'll depend upon a lot of other things.
I think the reason that I've written an article about this and that you and I wanted to talk is because we are in this kind of moment where the United States has just committed a hostile act towards a sovereign country. That country might well retaliate violently. It's not clear. And if Iran did retaliate violently, there might be a push. I mean, Donald Trump has promised that he's going to start, bombing Iran back to the Stone Age and, committing all kinds of war crimes against their civilian populations. So, but whether or not wars happen, I think depends in part on whether propagandists succeed in convincing people that wars are a good thing. And if you look back, I mean, I cite in the article World War I and the Vietnam War as very clear examples of a population that really had no grievance against the party that they went to war with, but was whipped up into a frenzy of nationalism through focusing on the wrong questions, through people being dehumanized systematically. And so what you and I wanted to talk about is not so much the geopolitics of this.
No, there's a lot up in the air on that, and that's going to get sorted out one way or another.
because there are a lot of people speculating on what Iran does now with the internal structure of the Iranian government. Does this embolden the hardliners or whatever?
Mhm.
But you and I kind of wanted to talk about the way that wars are talked about, the way that conflict is talked about, the way that the United States' actions are discussed within the United States, and the kind of effect that that can have.
Yeah, well, because I think, and the two examples that you pull out in the article of World War I and the Vietnam War are super instructive here, right? Because there's an alternate universe in which Franz Ferdinand is assassinated and we don't go to war. And there's also an alternate, and the whole world doesn't go to war. And there's also an alternate universe in which Vietnam successfully kicks out the French, and that's it.
Yeah, right.
And the U.S. doesn't. I mean, and you know, we'll talk about him a lot during this podcast, but Chomsky is very good on this, where he's very clear that there, at no point in the lead up to the Vietnam War was there ever a legitimate justification for it in the ways that you might have said that there were around World War II, for example, where you might have had a really hard time not justifying not going to war. But in Vietnam, you just, and same with World War I, you just sort of end up in war. And I think what we want to talk about is how you end up in war when you don't really mean to. And the huge way that that happens is by propaganda that is put out by the government and parroted almost entirely by mainstream media organizations.
Yeah, that's the case. I mean, the United States could have supported the Vietnamese independence movement from the start if it had actually believed in its supposed founding principles, but it chose not to. And it chose to...
but then once you're in there and then people, and then you know, Americans are dying. I put that in quotes not because people weren't actually dying, but because we only care about American lives in these conflicts. But once you get in there and there are the hardships of war are there, it's a lot easier for people to then get on board once it's already started.
Yeah, one of the things that happens and the way these things escalate is our country does something that it never should have done in the first place, then people from our country are killed, or there's some kind of excuse for escalating, and then we dig in and it gets worse and worse and worse, and there is a cycle of violence that it's very difficult to pull back from. It's especially difficult when US soldiers die, for instance, right? So if in the current situation, Iran was to retaliate for what is an illegitimate murder by committing some atrocity against the United States, then people in the United States don't think to themselves, well, you know, we did provoke this. All they can see at that point, because they're being barraged with it, because the news is not going to be about the historical context. And nobody mentions the context beyond, I mean, the assassination is about as far back as you'd go. Right.
They're not going to mention anything from the 1950s, for example.
They're not going to mention the crucial fact with the Iran relations, which is that we did overthrow their democratic government within the lifetime of presently living people.
That's beside the point.
We did shoot down an Iranian civilian airliner, killing hundreds of people, and refused to apologize for it.
Yes. So we've done a lot of bad things. Before we really get started, one counter argument that I want to deal with immediately, because we're talking about what the actions of Iran might be towards the United States, is you see this a lot that, oh, so you're justifying whatever violence Iran does, and then the violence that the US does is bad, and really this is, you're a hypocrite, right? You don't criticize Iran because you know, Soleimani has done a lot of things. The Iranian government has done a lot of
why aren't you criticizing them?
Why aren't you criticizing them? You're only criticizing the US. And I think it's worth dealing with that criticism, because it's often made, even though it's quite silly, it's often made. And it's also something that I think sounds good on its face and gets you over the hurdle into believing the propaganda and not listening to some of the criticism as much. So I figure we should address that first, and then we can kind of get into some of the other things.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things. The first thing is that there's a reason why people within the United States should focus on the actions of the United States, because ours are the actions that we have to control. This is why most of your own personal moral introspection should be devoted to your own actions, because those are the actions that you have some agency over. So there's a reason that we're thinking about what the United States should do in any given situation as people in the United States. But the other point is that I actually think you should look at the justice of the two parties' actions. You should look at, I mean, is what Iran does in any given situation, is that fair and justified given what we have done? Who has the moral high ground in any given situation? But in order to do that, you do have to look at history, and you do have to look at context. And you can say that Iran has committed some kind of atrocity. Certainly, the no supporter of the Iranian government, and also believe that the United States at the same time has committed actions that make that kind of thing more likely and that undermine our own claims to be the morally superior party.
Right. And I think both of those things are important. I mean, I do think that people that make the hypocrisy argument that you're not criticizing Iran, you're only criticizing the US. First, I don't think that anyone actually makes it in good faith entirely, in the sense that, look, even if that was true, let's imagine that that's true, that I'm only criticizing the United States government and I'm ignoring any atrocity committed by the Iranian government. It doesn't make what the US government is doing good.
Right.
The fact that I don't criticize someone else doesn't make the US what the US government has done suddenly good. So that doesn't justify any of the US actions. But I also think that it's vitally important to criticize the Iranian government. Like I have no solidarity with the government of Iran. I have solidarity with the people of Iran and in particular with the leftists of Iran, who I assume also oppose war as good leftists do. But I don't have, the Iranian government, I'm not a fan, as I'm not a fan of the United States government. So I think yes, obviously we should criticize actions done by the Iranian government. But I think your first point is the vital one, which is, yes, we can say that, X is bad in another country or whatever, but we do have more control over the actions of the United States government, to the extent that we have any control at all. And it is important, particularly for us, to oppose the United States taking these violent actions abroad, and also, committing troops into a ridiculous war. And that's the place where we have power. Once again, as I assume Iranian leftists should be doing the same in their own country.
You and I have often said that the central slogan of the anarchists or libertarian socialists could be, both of those things are bad.
Both of those things are bad. The Iranian government is not good, but it's not, that doesn't justify killing people writ large. It also doesn't justify killing someone in particular that's going to cause massive harm and possibly war later on.
I'm no Ayatollah stan.
You heard it
category
here first.
Of people on the left.
You heard it here.
It's not one of the things I identify as.
Yes, I also am no Ayatollah stan. Not even a fan. If there's
not even a fan. Don't even rise to the level before stan. Yeah, so I think one of the things we want to do is talk about, you mentioned that we sort of grew up in the Iraq era, and we want to think about what the lessons of that conflict were, because looking back on it, it was an unmitigated catastrophe.
Yes.
500,000 people, Iraqis, are estimated to have died. The United States, which is, that's the most important thing, right? That's
it's a large amount of people.
It's a very, very large amount of people who are dead now, who would be alive now if it were not for actions taken by the Bush administration.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty clearly true. And so, and that's in addition to, of course, the colossal, the people in the United States who could have had the money that was spent on that destructive war spent keeping them alive.
Right.
And so,
and the U.S. troops.
There are costs and the dead U.S. troops.
And the infrastructure of Iraq, which completely crumbled afterwards. And sort of, all Iraqis that could have benefited from healthcare had been better established and not destroyed, etc.
Maybe we wouldn't have had ISIS. There's a lot of things that might not have happened.
A lot of things. So, premise, Iraq War, bad.
Iraq War, not good. So if we look back to the origins of that war, we can think about, well, what was it that allowed a war that was a catastrophe to happen and to have sufficient political and public approval that this thing occurred? And how do we make sure that that process doesn't occur a second time with Iran? Because there are certainly warmongers who want the United States to go to war with Iran, people who have for a long time. And if Iran commits some kind of violent act against the United States, that will get worse, and there will be more people calling for the United States to blow them back to the Stone Age or whatever.
And those are the people, to be clear, on the mainstream news channels
MSNBC.
Right now. I mean, Karl Rove is on the television right now. Max Boot is on. All the people that supported the Iraq War are now the Middle East experts that are being called on to talk about what the U.S. should do in this situation.
People who, now you and I are prison abolitionists, but people who, if the laws were applied in a fair way, fair being consistent, not ultimately just, people who would be in prison right now are instead on cable news.
Yeah, I mean, this is also a Chomsky line, but if we applied the Nuremberg standards post-war, not just every president that we've had post-World War II would be found guilty under those standards, but also many of the senior advisors would also be held very guilty under those standards. And I think that's worth noting, just for the mere fact of, maybe if you would have been guilty under the Nuremberg standards, we shouldn't listen to you about what we should do in wartime.
That's your first Chomsky drop of our discussion, and I'm drinking out of my Noam Chomsky mug. I had also just been thinking, when you mentioned criticizing the United States alone, that the example Chomsky always uses is Soviet dissidents. Like, no one would ever criticize Soviet dissidents for talking too much about the Soviet Union and not
enough about the U.S.
That would be absurd. And one of the things we're going to get to is thinking about how things would sound if they're applied to other people. But so I think the central lesson of that build up to the Iraq War, for me, looking back on it, is government claims aren't necessarily true. And it sounds like a thing that everyone's like, well, of course government claims are, all governments lie. Everyone from the right wing who say, we want to drown the government in the bathtub, government can't do anything right, to people on the left, we're all cynical about governments. And yet, whenever government officials say things, those things do enter the discourse as if they're true. So, General Soleimani was, according to the United States government, plotting attacks on United States soldiers, and they had to stop him because he was plotting attacks on United States soldiers. And then, of course, that gets repeated over and over and over by everyone. I read Ben Shapiro's Twitter feed, and it's full of him saying, how could you possibly believe that we can't stop someone who is plotting attacks on our soldiers? And the argument then goes onto the territory. Now, we're going to get to analyzing arguments, but the argument gets onto the territory where we assume the facts to be true, and we're having a debate whether it was legitimate to stop someone who was plotting attacks on our soldiers, before we've had a conversation, which we never will have, about the evidence for whether the claim that's being made is true. And during the Iraq War,
of which there is none, right? At the moment, there is very little evidence, according to both internal U.S. government sources as far as whether there was an imminent attack, and also according to the Iraqi government, who was being visited by Soleimani. There seems to be very little, if any, evidence at all. But obviously, that's not the narrative now. Is he has been historically a very, very bad guy.
Historically,
who we have always wanted
yes.
to kill, and the fact that you haven't heard about him until now doesn't really matter. He's always been enemy number one, and he was planning an imminent attack. Yeah,
and what's interesting is that, like, the imminent attack thing is like the main relevant set of facts, right? Because if someone is planning an imminent attack on you, now we can debate whether and we should, the justice of that attack, because the United States isn't automatically in the right. But if someone's planning an attack, that provides the set of justifications for it being a self-defensive maneuver. But what's interesting, as you say, is that, like, the conversation seems to shift from he was planning an imminent attack, and also here were all these other things that he did that made him a bad person. If you look at Mike Pence's justification for the attack on Twitter, Mike Pence says he was preparing imminent attacks, and also he had been responsible for the deaths of U.S. soldiers in the past. He had
been linked to 9/11.
He brought up 9/11, and he said Iran helped the hijackers on 9/11, right? And he said that in a very, in a way that was very misleading, right? Because there's no evidence that Iran intentionally helped plan 9/11. It's that they allowed the people who would become the hijackers to pass through the country. But the point is that the evidence, the zeroing in on is the claim, the central claim that would justify an attack like this, is that claim true? That discussion is not had. And instead we have discussions about, was this strategically wise? Was this, was this lawful? That's an important conversation. And was this a bad dude?
And was this a bad dude has a number of different facets to it, because people, one, are assuming, yes, bad dude, and two, are assuming if this guy was a bad guy, then it was justified to kill him. Now, that second question is never discussed, whether just because someone is bad, it's okay to kill them. And I think that's the important question, because people make that argument who don't believe that, for example, about the death penalty in the United States of America. And to your point about what it would sound like if other people said this, all of the things, Soleimani doesn't seem to have been a good guy. I think the facts of this particular thing are an issue, and some of the facts being dredged up by the United States government are questionable. But like most generals, doesn't seem to have been a bad guy, or doesn't seem to have been a good guy. Neither are any of the U.S. generals. Any of the things that someone is saying about Soleimani could easily be said about anyone that has participated in any of the U.S. wars. And I think that's important, not because I'm trying to diminish the badness of it, but what I'm saying is, if you think it is justified to kill Soleimani, then you also think that it is justified to kill scores of United States leaders. That should make you question whether you think it's justified.
Yeah, so I think it provides a good opportunity to get to one of our central points that I think is one of the main things that we take from Chomsky's work, and one of the things that is so important if we're ever going to think clearly about the world and our role in it, which is that everyone who analyzes the relationships between the United States and another country needs to take the time to imagine how everything that's being said by everyone would sound if the parties were reversed, and the same thing were being done to us as we are doing to others, right? And when you take something like this, first, the context of it is the United States invasion of Iraq. So when we say things like, this guy was responsible for the killing of United States soldiers, we are saying so in the context of those soldiers being in Iraq, right? They're not in the United States. He didn't come to the US and start killing soldiers on a base in Florida, right? even assuming the factual allegations, this is in the context of the Iraq War, an illegal, criminal, mass murdering war that we initiated, right? And so you have to think,
on no evidence.
What if
itself
Iraq had invaded the United States? If Iraq had invaded the United States and, United States soldiers had killed Iraqis, and then Iraqis had said, you're killing Iraqi soldiers. You're going to, well, that's true. We are, but there is some context here. And it's that you overthrew our government years ago. So I think it's really, really important to evaluate all of those things because they affect, one of the things we want to talk about is euphemisms and the way that language is used, and language is used that doesn't apply to our deeds but only applies to other people's deeds. There's even a debate over whether this was an assassination, where if this was done to us, again, there would be no question that if the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff was killed by
bombed.
A drone that was specifically targeting him because of things he did, that you would be able to say that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had been assassinated, right? So it really...
I mean, the assassination point is sort of interesting because the argument, as far as I can tell from the side that says that it's not an assassination, is that he's essentially already an enemy combatant. And so this is a death within war. And there's a couple of things that are going on there, right? One, I actually don't care if it's labeled an assassination or not, in the sense that you still went and killed someone. It was still a very bad thing. But to the extent that it matters whether you call it an assassination or not, what the people that say that it's not an assassination are assuming is that we're basically in a state of perpetual war with Iraq and also with Iran. And that killing anyone kind of in that region is pretty much free game and an act of war and has really no moral culpability to it whatsoever. And the implications of that are kind of staggering because, one, it's a huge devaluing of human life, which is always the first central point. But two, it does mean that you are treating war as if it is inevitable and if it is always ongoing. Yeah. And that's not good for people that don't want war, that want to live.
And it certainly accepts that war doesn't need to be declared, because there's
especially
no declared
not by Congress
war with Iran. So it does provide the president with an immense amount of power to decide, again, without having to present evidence, as long as you say this person was a threat. And that was, to go back to Iraq, that was the justification that was provided for Iraq, was government officials said that Saddam Hussein posed an imminent threat to the United States. And then there was a debate over whether, given that was their justification, whether it was lawful to go to war. Mm-hmm. But the actual underlying evidence kind of got skipped. And to go back to this point about government claims, the New York Times infamously printed headlines that said things like, U.S. says that Saddam Hussein is intensifying his quest to get parts to build a nuclear weapon. Mm-hmm. And the idea here is that you can, as long as you are saying that the U.S. says it and not that it's true, you as a journalist have done your job, right? I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying that that's what the government says. And you're technically right that your headline isn't false. When your headline is U.S. says Saddam Hussein, that is what the U.S. said. But the impression that people get from you printing that in the news is that there is some basis for their saying that beyond the fact that they said it. And unfortunately, the lesson does not appear to have been learned, because I don't see the kind of demand for evidence that I think should have been what came out of and was the central lesson from the Iraq disaster.
I think that's central. And part of the reason, and this kind of gets into the second thing that we wanted to talk about, part of the reason why there isn't a demand for evidence is because of the logical leaps that people are making. So I actually think you do a really good job laying this out in the article that you put up. So I want to read the first paragraph of the section that's called "Do not be bullied into accepting simple-minded sloganeering." So I think it gets at this point.
Okay.
So you start off this way. Let's say that long before Ted Kaczynski began sending bombs through the mail, you once rented him an apartment. This was pure coincidence. Back then, he was just a Berkeley professor. You did not know that he would turn out to be the Unabomber. It is, however, possible for me to say and claim, I am not technically lying, that you housed and materially aided the Unabomber. A friend of mine once sold his house to the guy who turned out to be the Green River Killer, so this kind of situation does happen.
And my friend was very pissed off when I said, so you helped the Green River Killer.
I feel bad for your friend. But the thing that these two things go hand in hand, right? The lack of evidence and the lack of curiosity, where mainstream media organizations and people sort of just generally will parrot what government information is as though it's fact and only sort of couch it or add the caveat of, well, the US government says, but then continue to proceed as though that's true. And then the second thing is that evidence, even when it is true, can be described in a very misleading way.
Right.
And a lot of this is, well, US sources say, okay, so we have the US sources who are saying it, that's your first caveat, that, Soleimani materially aided those who participated in 9/11.
Right.
Well, that might not, that sentence can't be false in the sense that US sources do say that. But even if you remove the US sources, sure, it's technically true. But saying someone, perhaps, but saying someone materially aided the 9/11 attackers leads to very serious conclusions. And if you're an actual journalist, if you're a serious journalist, then you probably want to be careful about the way that you say things, even things that are technically true.
So the reason that I mentioned this Unabomber example and the 9/11 thing is one of the claims that Mike Pence makes in his series of tweets, as I mentioned, is that Soleimani aided a bunch of the hijackers. Now, Pence gets a number of the number of hijackers wrong.
Yeah, he gets all the facts wrong, but that doesn't really matter.
But there's a National Review article that says Pence was right. And the National Review article says, look at the 9/11 Commission report. In the 9/11 Commission report, it says that Iran didn't stamp the passports of the 9/11 hijackers when they passed through, I think it's some years before. And so the claim that is made is, the claim that turns into is Iran helped the hijackers. Now, the 9/11 Commission report says we don't have any evidence that they were trying to do 9/11. And Soleimani's not mentioned, right? So there's a big leap that says that actually anything that Iran does, you can credit to Soleimani. But the point here that you're making is, even when the facts are true, what you can do is you can spin the facts in a way that, and people they want to start arguing on the factual grounds, and it might be a mistake, right? So there are people who criticize Mike Pence saying, well, that's ridiculous because Soleimani was a Shia and the hijackers were Sunnis and he'd never helped Sunnis. And the National Review says, well, actually, the 9/11 Commission report says that Iran and Al-Qaeda, were allied at a certain point. But you might be wrong on the facts, but you got to think about how the facts are being presented, and whether and during wartime, during these kind of feverish, these moments where the drums are being beaten, subtleties of argument get lost. And I remember this so well from Iraq and the post 9/11 era, where if you said something like, as Chomsky did, 9/11 was the predictable result of various parts of the United States foreign policy, you would be told that that would be characterized as, you think the United States deserved 9/11. You think those civilians deserved to die. And there's a leap and a fudging, and they're not they're sort of, but they might quote you directly, right? But then the spin that is put on it is a spin that is unfair. But during these moments of war fever, all of the nuances get lost. So if you say, like, I don't think killing other countries' generals during peacetime is acceptable, that will be spun as, so you think terrorists should walk the earth. That's what you think. That's
or
what
so you
saying.
think this guy was a good guy. Or I distinctly remember discussions about the massive civil liberties violations that were going on at U.S. airports, and indefinite detention, and the sort of Islamophobia that was going on, post 9/11 and then into the Iraq War, and still continues to this day. I very much remember people saying, well, I don't think that you should racially profile or detain people because they're Muslim. And people saying, oh, so you don't care about national security. And obviously there are multiple arguments, but the thing is, there's a series of arguments before you even get to the question of, look, like, if it was true that Soleimani did X, and if it was also, you didn't frame it in a way that made it seem bigger than it was, and you went through all of these things, then we would still have to actually decide whether something was justifiable. But there's about 5 things that go before that get completely run over. And those things are kind of important, because those things are about truth and whether it's okay to kill people, which I generally think that it's not. But we kind of pass by all of those things.
And yeah, there's such simple-mindedness that occurs, and you see it I've already seen Bernie Sanders' response to the attack being characterized as, well, Bernie Sanders clearly doesn't care about terrorism, because if you look at the different Democratic presidential candidates' responses, Pete Buttigieg emitted a word salad that meant nothing, saying, I have questions. Elizabeth Warren, but everyone was in character. Like, Elizabeth Warren initially put out a really bad statement and then put out a better statement because...
Beto O'Rourke's statement was surprisingly good.
Everyone gets better after they leave the political arena, and Bernie Sanders just was the only one who just sort of really forcefully condemned the thing and didn't even really mention. He didn't do the throat clearing about how, well, this was a murderer and a terrorist, but there was a process thing. He just said, no, we're hurt. The administration is trying to escalate conflict with Iran, and we won't tolerate that. And of course, the response is, so you don't think that Soleimani is a murderer? You don't think he's a terrorist?
And the real thing is, well, one, I'm not going to believe that just because the U.S. government says it. Now, there does seem to actually be evidence that that's true. But 2, even if that is true, then there is a question of, so you think that it's okay to just go kill people? I mean, there's a bunch of people that have done very similar things, and the problem that's emerged, and I saw this from folks like the Pod Save America guys or like Ezra Klein, was the questions that they were asking, right, were, okay, well, obviously this guy was bad, so they adopted the US government stance immediately. Yeah. And obviously, therefore, the killing is justified. That's fine. But the real questions we have now are sort of, what is the geopolitical fallout, and why was there not a good enough press strategy after the fact, and why wasn't there sort of some more process?
It was impulsive.
It was impulsive. There should have been, like, you should have informed Congress before you did it, or you should have. And once you say, well, like, the problem was whether you informed Congress or not, you've ceded the ground of, one, who is this person? And 2, regardless of who he is it okay to kill someone, and okay to go bomb them, particularly during peacetime? And those seem to have all been ceded. And now the biggest critiques that I've seen are been, Trump was impulsive. Trump didn't go through normal process. Trump may have put American soldiers, not Iraqi lives, not Iranian lives, not lives of anyone else in the world, American lives at risk. I mean, and frankly, American lives actually may be at risk. So it is bad for those American lives, but it's also, I mean, everyone in the region, it's funny because, Israel also commits a lot of war crimes, and non-war crimes. But if I was in Israel right now, I'd be quite upset at the United States because they've made a very dangerous situation.
Yeah. You see a shift from the focus on whether this was justified to whether it followed process, and how it was strategically. The
Right.
Atlantic's article was like, this was worse than a crime, it was a blunder. And
Right. Was it good strategy? Not was it
strategy
justifiable?
And they said, and the Atlantic article led off by saying there was a case for killing him. And the funny thing is, if you actually look at the case, it's highly questionable. It says he helped the Yemenis fight Saudi Arabia, and you're like,
seems good.
I don't know. That's a case for killing him. That seems to be a case that he was on the right side of that conflict. Anyway, but they say, well, the case for killing him is evident, but strategically, how does this affect American interests? Actually, this is a disaster for American interests. And so you say, I'm harshly criticizing the president because I think that what he's done is a disaster for American interests. But these are the kinds of debates you saw in Vietnam among liberals too, which is that people who were critics of mainstream critics of the president would not say, well, I think this entire war is an atrocity against the Vietnamese and we invaded their country. They'd say, I think this war is a blunder, that it is not helping our country, that it is wasting our money and our lives. The Vietnam
waste
War,
of resources.
The Vietnam War memorial is not a memorial to Vietnamese people. It is a memorial to American soldiers. And, those American soldiers were young men who were killed by the score. Truly tragic. They're serious victims. However, they're not the only victims. In the United States, all discussions in this country tend to be premised on the idea that our national interest is the only legitimate interest that we have to care about. So, if something that is barbaric does turn out to be in our personal interest, it's legitimate. And it's worth thinking about what we would think of a person who thought this way, which is like, my only question is about, when evaluating my actions, is whether they personally enrich me and serve my interest. That person would be a sociopath.
Right. Well, I think it's actually interesting thinking about when the U.S. thinks that they have won a war or not. Because I think historically the U.S. thinks that it's won every war except for perhaps the Vietnam War and the war in Iraq. And on one hand, you could say, haha, take that, U.S. empire, you don't win everything. But what they mean is that they didn't accomplish all of the ends that U.S. empire wanted to accomplish in that. But the Vietnamese and the Iraqis did not win that war either. They lost hundreds of thousands of people. And people were slaughtered. And so it's a very strange thing to do that glibly. And I think it is glib to say, oh, well, we have to think only about the strategy and the strategy for U.S. interests. I mean, you talked about the Vietnam War. I remember during the Iraq War, people talking about this all the time. What would the Iraq War do for oil prices? What would the Iraq War do for the economy? Would the possibility of a draft affect, whether people were going to go to college or not? And if there had been a draft, would that have affected the amount of money that we were willing to put into the war? The amount of money that we spend on war is an important point, in the sense that we could spend that money on much better things, including healthcare and houses for everyone and, jobs programs and a Green New Deal. But the money is secondary to the lives that will be lost of Americans, but also probably more primarily of the people that the Americans are attacking, whether that's Iraq or Iran, because they will probably lose more lives.
There is still a buried nationalism in this country that runs very, very deep, and that causes people in this country, many of them, to think of the people in other countries basically as having the moral status of ants. Like, the Iraq War, right? It's 500,000 people. And Michelle Obama says that George W. Bush is her best friend, her partner in crime, that they share values, right? This is a guy who's responsible for the deaths of so many people. And it's bizarre that even supposedly progressive people don't recognize the humanity of that man's victims enough to be able to condemn him as the monster that he is. And
they don't, and they never, and honestly, I don't know if they ever will, because I'm going to say something that I think can get you a lot of flack, but I don't understand why, which is, if you just compare the Iraqi lives lost in the Iraq War versus the lives lost in 9/11, there's like it is staggering. If we lost 500,000 people in the United States, if 500,000 people inside the United States were killed, imagine in orders of magnitude the reaction that we had to 9/11 in orders of magnitude to that degree. But I think if you say that, people are like, oh my God, how dare you say it's like you're diminishing 9/11. You only think that diminishes 9/11 if you think Iraqi lives are worth less than US lives.
And I mean, if this country were invaded by an outside power, would anyone judge those who resisted violently? No, nobody would. I mean, in fact, they'd be treated as heroes, but as we know. So I think the real scary thing is that during these times when the United States might be in conflict, commits an act of war, and we don't know what's going to happen next, so much bullshit flies around, and it is very difficult to think clearly. It is very difficult to remember what things look like from the other side. It is very difficult to remember what the discussion should be about. Even those of us who are very critical can go like, well, you need congressional approval for a war, or we can get caught up in the legal question. Was this legal, right? And the legal question is important in that, like, international law is a very important part of, like, making sure every country adheres to a common agreement as to what acceptable behavior is. But also, like, even if something were legal, it wouldn't necessarily be right. And we have to zero in on the question of the justice of an action and the justice of the consequences of that action. And so there's so many distractions, and it's really hard because so many things are said without evidence, and then you're like, where's the evidence? But then by that point, people have moved on and everyone's saying it. That was true with Iraq and 9/11. It'll probably be true with Iran and 9/11, because all you have to do, because 9/11 is a very deep emotional wound for Americans. Like, saying 9/11, like,
as it should be, I mean, as it should be, many people lost their lives. But the legal question is kind of interesting here in the sense that the legal question for me is important because of the reasons for the legal regime that we have, right? So traditionally, supposedly, I've heard tell that Congress is supposed to be the body that declares war and not the president.
Are you sure? I've never seen that happen.
I've heard that. I've heard a rumor that that's the case. There's an actually pretty solid reason why that's the case, in the sense that Congress is the more democratic body that is more in touch with the people that are actually represented in the country, whose constituents will feel the brunt of the war, who may have to send their children or go off to war themselves, that are actually somewhat more accountable and might therefore be more cautious about going to war. And so when the president takes executive action, it's formally illegal, but it also bypasses that kind of process. Now, as you were saying, if that had been the case, that doesn't make it justifiable. The Iraq War, famously, is legal in the United States, not internationally, where it's clearly a war crime. But in the United States, the Iraq War is legal. And part of the reason why Congress was able to vote for that without much backlash at the time was because of what we're talking about now, which was because of lies put out by the executive branch and other branches of the federal government, and those lies being exacerbated and parroted by the mainstream media. And so we may very well get to you may say, well, I care about the legality of this war. I think you then need to ask yourself, would you be okay with it if Congress voted for it? Because there is a world in which Iran retaliates, and then people would have a very hard time in Congress not voting for war. And I think you would only have people like AOC or
Bob
Ilhan
Ridley
Omar,
at AOC would be like,
right, not voting for war. And I think war would pass if Iran attacked the US, and everyone would forget that it was because the US started it. Or they would say, even if that's the case, even if that first action was wrong, it doesn't affect what we have to do now.
And then, just like with the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam, like in a couple of years, once war fevers died down, everyone looked back and go, oh shit, the justification for the war was completely bogus. But by that point, a lot of people will be dead.
Well, and we just didn't the Washington Post just release a bunch of documents about how not only was the justification for the Iraq war bogus, but everyone knew?
I mean, I haven't read whatever they.
I think that there was just
I know they just did the long thing on Afghanistan about how that war was a.
And Afghanistan as well. Like, so there's documents linking sort of both of them, but the war in Afghanistan as well. Like, there's no. The evidence is shoddy, and then we still don't even get to the question of, even if the evidence was completely clear, what choice we actually get to make.
Right. Yeah, there's this implicit assumption in a lot of the discourse that we are allowed to do whatever we want. So when you talk about this as a blunder, there is the assumption that the United States gets to decide whether or not to assassinate a high-ranking foreign official. And maybe we decide not to, or maybe we decide to, and it's a mistake, but we have the power and it's legitimate for us to make that decision, to play God, right? Because even if God decides to let you live, he's still making the choice, right? But we wouldn't accept this with any other country. I mean, U.S. exceptionalism is such an arrogant way of thinking. It's just pervasive in this country, even among Democrats. I mean, Democrats are all criticizing Trump, not saying that, like, that we don't have the right to kill a high-ranking Iranian official.
We do. Of course we do, as long as we have good strategy, as long as it's wise.
But was it wise? Was the correct procedure followed? That sort of thing. So we get to wage aggressive acts of war that we wouldn't tolerate from anyone else. So I think that's truly important. And then one of the points that I think is so important in these times is remembering what words mean and how language is used to conceal realities, because we don't have direct access to so much of the world. We have to read about it. We have to watch clips of it. We have to listen to it. It is portrayed to us through language. And so euphemisms are very powerful because the reality of what happened at the Baghdad airport is a person's body being blown apart and pieces of that person scattering everywhere. That's the thing that happened. But even that, I'm just kind of saying it with words. You're not really getting an actual sense of what that is and what we did that would allow you to really understand and evaluate the action being taken. And then we get even away from direct language like the language I've just used to even assassination doesn't quite convey that. And then people say, oh, it's not an assassination, it's a neutralization. We just neutralized an operative, and you get this really, really abstract language that is the language that really allows governments to commit atrocious acts and then say, well, we stabilized a region, we pacified, we neutralized, just these things that really mean nothing.
Yeah, I mean, euphemisms, I think euphemisms are funny because everyone knows that they're silly. Right? When you say, oh, isn't it silly to call this pacifying a region when what you actually mean is bombing it? Everyone's like, ha, ha, ha. Yes, that of course is silly. But people adopt that into their everyday language. And it is vitally important, it seems like, for the government and for the mainstream media to use these. I mean, I remember all these euphemisms being used during the Iraq War. And then there was, articles from the first Gulf War about what was it called? Liberating a region, which actually just meant bombing it until the sand turned into glass. And you see this across the board, right? Enhanced interrogation techniques instead of torture, officer-involved shooting instead of murder committed by a police officer.
It involved him, which is not false.
It did
involve an officer.
But it's all of these things all the euphemisms do two things in my mind. One is they soften the experience. So war doesn't seem so harsh. It doesn't seem like people's bodies are being torn into a million pieces when a bomb lands on them. It seems like they're being neutralized. That sounds pleasant. Pacified sounds sort of soft. But also the other thing that it does is it dehumanizes. It dehumanizes people, and they're right. They're not a human being.
In quite a literal
they're
sense.
A target. They're
right?
a target. They're not a human. They're a target. They are an operative as opposed to a parent, or a child. It like enhanced interrogation technique even strips away the thing that you're doing to someone's human body. The focus is on the information that you're getting rather than the fact that you're torturing a human being.
And it really is so important that individual people insist on using precise language that as best as possible conveys the underlying thing going on. Because the press isn't going to do it. And there's an effort to make controversy over these words so that the press fears using the clear language, because that would be taking a stand in an ongoing controversy. So that's what happened with torture, right? Where things that should have been uncontroversially torture, that the Bush administration, uncontroversially labeled torture, that the Bush administration was doing, the press wouldn't call torture because the Bush administration said, no, it's not, it's enhanced interrogation. And then there's a controversy, and the press says, well, we don't want to take a side in this because then we wouldn't be objective.
So we use different language.
And the AP just put out an article about the word assassination and why they're not using it. And it's because it's controversial. So it's controversial because the United States denies that this was an assassination, that it was an assassination. And therefore, the AP isn't going to describe what was plainly an assassination as an assassination.
Which is the other reason, the third thing that this does, along with sort of softening it and creating this controversy and dehumanizing people, is it also, it makes people who use even just accurate language seem crazy.
Yeah.
Right? If I say to you, the US has committed a series of war crimes, I think you already know from me just saying that, if you didn't know anything about me, that you would already know that I was a leftist, and you might think that I was a fringe leftist, because that seems like a pretty ridiculous thing to say. Now, obviously, if you actually just look at sort of the way that international law defines war crimes, it is completely uncontroversial that the U.S. has committed a series of war crimes, and that no one would debate that. But you seem like a lunatic. And I think, it's sort of the same way. The thing that this reminds me of as a recent example was how it immediately branded you as a fringe leftist to call what happened in Bolivia recently a coup.
A coup, yeah, right.
Even though...
And the press wouldn't call it a coup because it was controversial. And the press wouldn't call it
a coup because it was controversial, and so they had to find some other word. But by not calling it a coup, you sap all of the meaning out of that. And by anyone's definition, when the military takes over a country and strips the democratically elected leader of power, that is a coup.
Well, there is a language battle that occurs, and everyone needs to be aware of how the language battle works, because in the Bolivia case, the people who were invested in making sure the new Bolivian regime was made legitimate used very carefully, constantly portrayed Evo Morales as undemocratic and the new administration as the restoration of democracy. It wasn't a coup, it was a restoration of democracy. And then there's a controversy. So, as I say, the press doesn't use coup, but that controversy is being created. And so it is the responsibility of those of us who value the truth and want to make sure that things are called what they are, to notice the language battle and to fight back by insisting on saying things as they are. And I suppose just the last point in this whole thing that I kind of had was about the avoiding the sense that you're crazy. Because it's interesting that, Ben Shapiro was tweeting, it's insane to think that this was an assassination, right? So
Well, I think he said something even weirder. Something like, it's insane to think that the U.S. is the aggressor here.
Oh, yes, the insane to think the U.S. is the aggressor.
Which that's even crazier.
Because, like,
you're the person that bombed someone, you're the aggressor.
He wasn't. Yeah, right. I mean, but this effort to cast dissidents as mentally unstable, that's constant. Every government does that. They try and suggest that if you don't buy into the party line, the state line, you are crazy. And this is why the final point that I make in the article is that in order to resist feeling crazy, you need to have a community of people. You need to make sure that you are around others who perceive things accurately and that you don't give in to this pressure to have a discussion about a point that is irrelevant. I mention, that I keep a tiny Chomsky on my shoulder, constantly helping me perceive the world more clearly. And even when I disagree with the tiny Chomsky, I find it very useful to have perspectives that clarify and that resist and that make sure that we don't give in to consensus. Because in the lead up to war, what happens is there is an effort that, the Ionescu play Rhinoceros, where everyone slowly turns into a rhinoceros, and one person turns into a rhinoceros, then another person, and the person that you least think will turn into a rhinoceros turns into a rhinoceros. And the liberals that the people who you would think oppose the war, all of a sudden they start softening, and then they start saying things that you didn't think they'd say.
Yeah, and they start getting into the wonkery of it, or they're like, oh, well, I read an article that back in 2012, this guy did this. Well, that's not the point. The point is that this wasn't justified, or the point is that we shouldn't go to war. And I think that the tiny Chomsky is helpful for a couple of reasons for me also, because this sort of harkens back to something that we were saying in the beginning. One of the questions is, how would this sound if someone else said it? And I think the towing the party line, like, it's very easy, I think, for Americans to believe and understand the way that the Soviet regime created a party line, attempted to build consensus, forced consensus if necessary, and you seemed like a lunatic if you didn't fall in line with the Soviet party line. I don't know why it's then baffling to see the United States government doing pretty much the same thing and think that, oh, well, now the dissidents are crazy.
Yeah.
The dissidents are usually right. And I think we should still evaluate everything as it comes and evaluate everything on a factual basis, because the left has a tendency to do the other thing where the left has the tendency to do the pendulum swing, where it's like, well, you won't call it a coup in Bolivia. That means that Evo Morales was an angel and everyone that opposed him was Satan. And it's like, well, no, that's not true either, right?
In the extreme cases, it could be like, well, Assad hates the United States,
so Assad is great.
Assad is probably good or anti-imperialist.
Yeah,
like,
people or the people
Maduro,
you and I have seen this both with Assad and with Gaddafi, where for some reason people love him or love them because they have some kind of like anti-US stance, and it's fine to say like, maybe both those things are bad. Both of those things are bad. It shouldn't be controversial to say both Gaddafi and the United States are bad. But for some reason it is. And I think that the tiny Chomsky tells you, well, hey, now, everything has about 500 grains of salt that you should take. And you can actually, it should also encourage you. It's empowering in some sense. You are intelligent. You can sift through evidence by yourself or with the help of other people. And the media, it's very clear. I think if you look at some of the things that the media is doing and match them up kind of with what we're saying, if you look at euphemisms, if you look at these shoddy arguments, if you look at the inability to make logical points and to just skip to the end justification, and you say, oh, well, I actually see the media doing this, then I think you can take a step back and say, okay, well, let me figure out what are the facts here, and let me draw my own conclusions. I don't need the Atlantic or the AP or the New York Times drawing my conclusions, because if you let the New York Times draw your conclusions, well, the New York Times ends up drawing conclusions like Hitler doesn't seem like that bad of a guy.
Which, by the way, is the conclusion that, well, they just said
he wasn't that dangerous. His anti-Semitism wasn't real. It seemed to be overblown.
Yeah. Well, no, all they said was that experts say that Hitler's anti-Semitism is mostly for show. I wrote an article about the coverage of Hitler in the New York Times in the lead up to World War II, and it was atrocious.
But anyway, if you have different guiding principles, right? If your guiding principle is, truth and justice and empathy and sort of international solidarity with people, not with governments, then these are very easy things to avoid. If you think it's bad when human beings die because you understand what it would be like to be one of their loved ones, then it should not be very hard for you to think about that when someone is bombed. And similarly, it should not be very hard to avoid the government saying, well, the question here was whether it was strategic.
Oh, I mean, when you actually contemplate the reality of what we're talking about, I mean, when you think about, as you say, the effect on loved ones, when you think of what it's like to watch your child die in front of you, or your parent, like, again, we're talking about people being dismembered in front of your eyes, right? It's the most disturbing possible thing imaginable. And when you actually think about what the Iraq War really meant, that's when, you can't imagine being in a room with George W. Bush and being civil to him because of what the implications of war truly are and the things that we have to hide. I mean, we don't even show the photos. The photos in the newspaper never really show the true carnage of war. They always show like bodies in bags, but they never show you what's underneath that bag, because they know that if you saw what was underneath that bag, you would just be so fucking disturbed it would haunt your nightmares forever. I think, so, But I think the central lesson here that we want to convey is to encourage people to use their independent judgment and to not be pressured and bullied into accepting things that they know to be false or questionable as true. Because
a consensus will form.
Yes. That is the kind of vigilance, even among experts, even among good liberals, a consensus will form. And that is the kind of resistance, that you need that firm independence of mind. It is the only thing that stops atrocities. It is the only thing that in the Milgram experiment causes people not to get the shock treatment, right? Is when one person goes, excuse me, this is very fucked up and we should all stop. That is what the preservation of the limited amount of civilized society that we have managed to build, that is what the preservation of that civilization it depends on.
I mean, it's not easy either, right? It's not. No. I forget his name. The guy, the soldier in Vietnam at the My Lai massacre.
Hugh Thompson.
Hugh Thompson. It's not easy to be Hugh Thompson.
No, right. And Hugh Thompson, who during the My Lai massacre stepped in front of his fellow soldiers and said, "If you keep killing people, I'm going to kill you." And he was branded a traitor to the United States. He got death threats. He spent decades in obscurity. And the perpetrator of the massacre was celebrated as a folk hero, and there were songs about him. So you have to run the risk that you will be hated, because that is frequently what happens.
But it's the only moral position, and it's the courageous position. And I think, you really have to evaluate the facts. And look, there have been, pacifists and non-pacifists who have been against these wars across time, who have taken that stand. I'll do the last Chomsky point, which is, even against wars that seemed more justifiable, like World War II. I mean, you look at the actions of A.J. Muste. He, was a staunch pacifist. And I think it's important to also listen to that voice when you're making your evaluation of what you think is moral, what you think is justifiable, what you think it looks like when war is brought upon people that America has decided are its enemies. And then it's not inappropriate to also then think about what this will mean for, American families whose kids might go into the military or are currently in the military. What it'll mean, I think the human lives are the main point here, but the cost of war is also huge. And if we're a world that's on the precipice of climate crisis or already in it, we're a country that has thousands of people die from very treatable illnesses every year because we don't have adequate medical insurance or medical care. And so if you think those things are very fine to factor in, but there's about 15 first order questions that you need to ask yourself before you get to, was this strategic, or what will the cost be?
We need to have a world without war, right? That is an imperative. There is no alternative to a world without war. Either this world self-destructs or we manage to find peace. And I respect pacifists. The pacifists are frequently made fun of. But I've written an article called In Defense of Pacifism that was particularly about a World War I nurse, Vera Brittain, who saw every man in her life killed in World War I. And she was just a 100% absolutist on nonviolence. And, those sorts of people are made fun of. You say, so you wouldn't kill Hitler. But her point was that violence was such a disgusting act that she felt that there was no circumstance in which she could engage in it. The same way we would think of, rape, for example, right? Mm-hmm. It's weird that we don't think about justified rape, but we think about justified murder and justified violence, right? These should be things that horrify us so much that the idea of there being a circumstance in which they're justified is revolting to our conscience,
and should be very narrow. I mean, I think you and I like the sort of conceit of a rebuttable presumption, that you have a presumption and it takes a lot of evidence to go against that. And I think even if you're watching this and you say, I'm not a staunch pacifist,
right?
I think we can all agree that there should be a huge presumption that we don't kill people.
Yeah.
That death is bad and we don't want war. And to overcome that presumption, you should need a lot of evidence, and it shouldn't be the shoddy evidence that the government is putting out. It shouldn't be the euphemisms that the media is putting out. You should need overwhelming evidence to overcome the revulsion that is killing another person.
In fact, that should tell you exactly why all of the justifications of Soleimani's killing are not really justifications, because you don't just have to prove, number one, that he was bad guy. You don't even just have to prove that he was plotting attacks. What you have to prove is this was the only possible way to prevent future violence. Not this was a way, right? Mm-hmm. Because you might prove that this was a way, but you have to show that nothing else could have been done in order to justify the use of murder. And I think that presumption that you never kill unless you can prove that it's absolutely necessary, that's the one that we need to operate on. And when you look at it that way, then the United States' actions become pretty
completely indefensible.
Okay, well,
all right. I hope everyone enjoyed that.
It was distressing, but I feel as if hopefully informative.
Yeah, hopefully you can better evaluate media and the government's claims at this point. Hopefully you feel international solidarity with all of the people who would be extremely damaged by a potential war or by the warmongering that is currently going on. And hopefully you also go and read Nathan's article on www.currentaffairs.org and check out all of our other articles there.
And then subscribe to our print magazine.
Yes, subscribe to the print magazine, subscribe to the podcast, and to the Patreon.
The YouTube channel.
The YouTube channel. We talk about a lot of things. Some of them are about war and how we're not for it, but some of them are about manatees and how we like them.
I really fucking love manatees.
They're adorable.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good night.